Noa, everyone. Tatis Carlton Laktachulasharu Gover. I am a tribal citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, formerly of Nebraska and Kansas. We had real estate disagreements with the United States military back in the 19th century. So today I'm going to be presenting on dating oral traditions, radiocarbon, and Bayesian statistical analysis. I'm a PhD student at the University of Colorado, Boulder. So my outline today, I know that I'm speaking to a conference that's not in the Great Plains, so I want to be able to provide briefly Plains geography and background, and then a discussion on Indigenous archaeology, the oral traditions that I used for this research, and we're going to go through some probability distributions and Bayesian statistical analysis of radiocarbon data and how these can be used to investigate oral traditions and when they occurred. I have two case studies for us to look at, and then also building towards the future, how we can expand upon these same processes. So looking at Plains geography and background, this is kind of what we're talking about for the purpose of my research. We're talking about the Central Plains. And also, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Missouri River Basin up in North and South Dakota. So, the Central Plains in the U.S. here really is comprised of Nebraska, Kansas, western Iowa, eastern Colorado Front Range, and southeastern Wyoming. Now, the tribes or the nations that I'm going to be really talking about, there's three that I'll mention and two that we're really going to investigate. So the Pawnee, which is what I am, I'm in the Arikara, as well as the Wichita. All three of these nations are within the Northern Caddoan language family. Historically, we can see here on the map to the left, the Arikara in the 19th century were up here in South Dakota. They continued moving north. The Pawnees were in central and north central Kansas, and the Wichitas were down here on the borderlands between Oklahoma and Texas. Large earth lodge villages, sometimes palisaded. The Arikara ones definitely were, and we're talking about towns, not villages, towns of hundreds, if not thousands of people. So, as of course, when we talk about archaeology, there's classification that we got to talk about in archaeological cultures. And so we're going to be talking about Central Plains tradition, CPT, initial coalescent variant, ICV, extended coalescent variant, ECV, and lower loop phase. This is all under Lemmer's classification scheme from 1954. If any of you are familiar with Great Plains archaeological taxonomy, it is an absolute train wreck, just borrowed terms from the Southwest and Southeast. For example, lower loop phase isn't a phase of anything. It just is on its own, but it's a phase. So you got to do a lot of mental gymnastics when dealing in the archaeological record here. And in phases, the way they work in the Great Plains is they're not really based on time. You don't have one phase and the next phase. They're actually constricted to geographic location, architecture, pottery, and settlement patterns. So with Central Plains tradition, you have a bunch of phases that are all contemporaneous with one another. This is sometimes talked about the Central Plains mosaic, and hopefully we'll rework that. So this is how archaeologists have kind of looked at the relationship between some of these archaeological cultures, okay? Central Plains tradition becomes initial coalescent, which then separates to become lower loop, extended coalescent, and then historic Pawnee and post-contact coalescent, which is historic Arikara. Now, really, in the literature, archaeologists haven't been like, well, this is the actual relationship. It's part of that whole idea of like, well, this is based on the evidence, this is what we believe, and blah, 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 blah. But then if you bring Indigenous archaeology into it, right? What is Indigenous archaeology and how can this be used in conjunction with the archaeological record? Well, I really like George Nicholas's 1997 definition of Indigenous archaeology, right? Indigenous archaeology is an approach that is for, by, with Indigenous peoples in interpreting the archaeological record. Indigenous archaeology is the overlap between Western archaeological practice and Indigenous ontologies. Not one versus the other. And Indigenous archaeology, more importantly, is a collaborative approach. And in the United States, it's pretty common for people to do a consultative approach, but collaborative, right? Indigenous communities are with the project from the beginning to the end, and they're equal partners in looking at the archaeological record and answering questions about the past. Here at CU Boulder, we have one going on to renovate the Chop and Mesa Museum project in Mesa Verde. That's the Mesa Verde Museum. And so we're working not only with the national parks, but also Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and the 20 plus descendant communities who have ties to Mesa Verde. And this has been an ongoing project that everyone has been equal partners in since its inception. And for me in particular, I work very closely with my community. This isn't just me out here by myself doing this research. I work very closely with our TIPO, Matt Reed, our NAGPRA officer, Marty Only, a chief, and our unofficial Pawnee historian, Roger Echohawk, who is in the archaeological literature. So I'm very reliant on my elders in terms of how I conduct and approach my research. So talking about the oral traditions themselves, right? How do we compare oral traditions to the archaeological record, and how can we combine that knowledge? So, in terms of a coarse-grained approach, how do we look at oral traditions? Well, the ones that I particularly look at, I look at migrations. It's easy to find things in oral traditions talking about movement, where people were, because they have a relative chronology of events as well as place names. So for us, the Northern Cadoans, the Pawnee and Arikara and the Wichita, we all have this shared history of coming from the land of the stone houses to the southwest. No idea where that is. But as the three tribes moved eastward towards the Mississippi River, somewhere in Oklahoma, near the cross of the two big timbers, the Arikara went north and settled along the Upper Republican. As the Arikara are founding themselves, the Wichita and Pawnees move north along the Mississippi River towards the Missouri. But along that approach, a band of the Pawnees, the Skeeties, travel up the Missouri River and hang out with their relatives, the Arikaras. And the Skeeties come to the Upper Republican area. The Arikara move further north into the Missouri River along South Dakota and Nebraska. The Pawnees and the Wichitas catch up eventually. People start moving around. Now the Skeeties are in central Nebraska. The Arikaras have founded themselves in South Dakota. And the Pawnees, South Band Pawnees, not the Skeeties, are now in southern Nebraska, northern Kansas. And at some point, the Wichitas say, this isn't for us. We're going to go back down south. And then an event occurs in which all three, the Arikara Pawnee, the Skeetie Pawnee, and the South Band Pawnees, kind of coalesce along the Missouri River because of an event that drove them out. And the Wichitas are somewhere in the south at this point. And then we begin moving towards the proto-historic or proto-colonization period, in which the Arikaras move up the Missouri River, the Skeeties come back to central Nebraska, and the South Band Pawnees move to southern Nebraska, northern Kansas. And then we see their historic ranges there during contact. So we have these stories about movement. Pretty good. If you combine everybody's together, you get a fuller picture. But there's another oral tradition which kind of talks about ethnogenesis, which is important. And more importantly, this is a Skeetie oral tradition talking about how the Skeetie Federation was formed. It names a place. It happened near Wild Licorice Creek, which is near current-day Genoa, Nebraska. And more importantly, this oral tradition talks about how before the Federation was formed, the people lived in small, scattered hamlets that were square-shaped. But after the foundation, we began to live in circular earth lodges. So this is very critical oral tradition, because not only does it talk about place, but it talks about settlement pattern. And this is the closed man story. So how can you use radiocarbon to figure this out? Well, in this coarse grain approach, right, you can use some probability distributions of radiocarbon dates to look at frequencies of radiocarbon, right? If we're looking at a hearth and looking at radiocarbon dates associated with human activity, we can use these as proxies for human population. So what I did here, just to kind of look at what's going on, like when do we see people moving into the plains, or when do we see it highly populated? If you take all the radiocarbon data for the past 20,000 years, you can see a trend beginning, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So really right around the beginning of what we call the woodland period, we can see people coming into the area. And right around 1000 AD, there's a huge statistically significant spike in radiocarbon dates associated with more archaeological sites. These are farmers. But this is all of the Central Plains. So, well, how do we kind of suss out Oklahoma from Kansas to Nebraska, South Dakota, right? We need to kind of narrow this picture. So when you divide the area geographically by latitude, looking at, okay, what's the trend in North Dakota, South Dakota? What's the trend in Nebraska, Iowa, right? You guys see where I'm going with this. How do you identify this? And once we isolate the past 2,000 years, well, in this one, 3,000 years, really, you can see that spike beginning in 950 AD, and really all three of these. And you can see moving from south to north that the trend begins earlier in these southern SBDs, moving to the north. And then what seems could be really this 15th century, 1450, as a significant date, right? So really isolating where people are on the landscape. But this is still too coarse, right? We're not getting actual taxonomic information. This is a coarse scale approach and showing really the populations that are occurring based on radiocarbon as a proxy. So that's why you begin to use Bayesian, right? Many of us are familiar with this. It's become popular in American archaeology, North American archaeology, in the past 2 decades. So and this is going to be based on my thesis at the University of Wyoming, and that I'm fixing, doing better stuff with. But with Bayesian, you can get that precise data. So these are the dates I used. It's kind of for going back to Central Plains tradition, ICV, ECV, lower loop, post-contact. We're only talking about 388 radiocarbon dates once you evaluate them for their hygiene, right? You need to make sure they have good standard deviations. You really want things less than 100. Anything over 200 is not good. You want to make sure that the labs are done right. So you have to vet the data. So you end up with only 151 sites representing several American states and only 388 radiocarbon dates. And when you do these analysis, right, this is a mess, and I deeply apologize. Each one of these is a phase within either ICV or Central Plains tradition. This was not really good data management on my part, and I'm fixing that. And what we see, right, is the 1450, if you look alongside this on probability distributions, 1450 pops out again. We go from Central Plains tradition, these guys up here, which are characterized by small scattered hamlets, to initial coalescent variant. Ardsberger, Anoka, Campbell Creek around 1450, which are characterized as earth lodges. So you got to combine the data. You have to know the taxonomy of what you're working with, the archaeological record, the oral traditions, and the data. You use all these things together in conjunction with one another to build this narrative, right? So with some probability distributions, we can see migration of peoples, or at least people are increasing in the Central Plains. And then when you break down the geographic locations of these different Central Plains tradition phases with their Bayesian posterior density estimates, well, what do you see? Well, Upper Republican is one of the first ones that are identified. Here's Upper Republican. Steed Kisker, which is southeast along the Missouri River, is also one of the earliest. So you can see, putting all these guys together, that these early CPT populations are being founded in locations that are identified in oral traditions in terms of migration. During a time, right, 900, right, these are when these are starting to begin. So we're seeing these population increases when the Central Plains tradition is forming in the areas that are noted in oral traditions for when the Pawnees, Arikaras, and Wichitas first migrated. But we can do more than this, right? So we're identifying, like, okay, when did Clothesman happen? Well, roughly 1450. That's where the transition between CPT to ICV happened. Lower Loop is part of that transition, or Eatskari is another name for it. And here's Genoa, right? So taking the places noticed in oral traditions using the archaeological record and the radiocarbon dates helps give a more full picture. But we can kind of go further than this, right? So when we talk about really diffusion, when do the Pawnees and Arikaras split from one another? When everyone's kind of up on the Missouri River, when do they separate? And I think we believe a really good case study for this comes from Lynch, Nebraska, which is the work that I do with my advisor, Dr. Douglas Bamforth, who was Chris Kern's undergraduate advisor back in the day. So Lynch site is up here in northern Nebraska along the Missouri River. You can throw a stone into South Dakota. The site is 250 to 300 acres. It is over a mile long. Now, because of how large it is, this makes it the largest site on the Great Plains during the 14th and 13th centuries. So a lot of people have argued, well, maybe it's not. There's multiple occupations, but when you do the Bayesian analysis on it, of course, you find that it is occupied at the same time. You do see people build in some places earlier, and then kind of move westward. But it's occupied at the same time. So we know, okay, we have a site that's over a mile long, full of earth lodges. That's a huge population density. When you compare it to the outlying cultures, Oneota or Ponca Creek, other ICV sites, you see that this site, in particular, Lynch, is the first site that occurs in the ICV. And how it relates to Central Plain tradition. So it begins roughly around 1200, but it doesn't end until it's only a flash in the pan. It's only around for 100, 150 years. So what happens to all the people and transitions from cultural groups, right? They don't happen overnight. So how does this work within the oral traditions, and why does this matter? Well, there's an Arikara oral tradition specifically that talks about the Skeety Pawnee and the Arikara used to live together in a huge village. And it got so hard on the landscape that people were struggling to grow enough crops, enough corn to sustain the population. The way they decided to split up the population was that the strongest archer in the group went out to one side of the village and shot his arrow. And where that arrow landed, half the village would go north, and the other village would stay there. Well, Lynch is over a mile long. It has a huge population density. Is this, and in terms of other initial coalescent variant sites, this is the largest and the earliest. Is Lynch representing the place, the village in which this event occurred? And also, yeah, this is what when you Google search gives you when you look for Indian shooting bow and arrow. And so you can, with the power of Bayesian and like looking at radiocarbon, right? You can use that data to investigate indigenous ontologies, or really you use radiocarbon or investigate, the radiocarbon data with the indigenous ontologies, right? Because this is an approach that validates both forms of knowledge. And kind of looking towards the future, like what else can we do with this? How else can we, really use indigenous knowledge? Well, I've been doing a lot of language classes. So this happened a couple of weeks ago, actually. We got some guys who are bringing our language back. They have masters in linguistic anthropology from OU. And when we were talking about kind of even just traditional Pawnee band names, Skiri means wolf, Kitkahaki means little earth lodge village, Pitahawe data, man going downstream. We kind of talked after class, and Kitkahaki, Pitahawe data are part of a story that there was a village in Nebraska that got too large, and Pitahawe data references like those were the people that went with the man who went downstream to set up a new village. And once those people left, that's how the South Band name, the Kitkahakis, got their name, because once they were gone, they were a little Earth Lodge village. They weren't the big one they used to be before the Pitahawe datas left. And we have this South Band oral tradition that talks about, once all three of the South Bands were one single band known as the Kawarakis. And they lived near Niamah, in the southeastern corner of Nebraska, close to the Missouri River. So is Kikahaki and Pitahawi data, is this referencing the split, the diffusion of the Kawarakis, and how can we see that archaeologically? But is this representing Central Plains tradition, or is this representing initial coalescent variant, or even lower loop, which is proto contact Pawnee? So it's once you get to know the language and know more of indigenous knowledge, you can really investigate these things and use the radiocarbon record and the sites to really identify place, where, when, and the where and when, where the oral traditions can provide the why and how. And also, what I'd like to do, which I'm working on now for my dissertation, is using radiocarbon records and Bayesian specifically to redo the taxonomy for the Central Plains, and one that's not based on projectile points or environmental effects, but why don't we ask the indigenous groups, the Pawnee, Arikara, and those who reside in the Central Plains, how would you like your history or the past constructed? And you can use Bayesian based on the radiocarbon record to provide those end dates, begin dates for a different kind of taxonomy that places indigenous ontologies and ideas of the past rather than think, like when I go home and talk to my community back in Pawnee, Oklahoma, and I use terms like Central Plains tradition, woodland, archaic, they don't care. To them, it's confusing because they don't they're like, well, who gets to decide what all this is? So we could use Bayesian, and I hope to see this used elsewhere to reclassify how we look at the past here in the United States based on in the United States, Canada, Mesoamerica, on indigenous ontologies of the past, right? Rather, we taking the projectile point typologies out of it and do something new. So thank you all very much for your time and for allowing me to speak with you guys today. I really appreciate it.